Okay, if you will turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, and if you will take your worksheet from last week, which is number 4 up in the top right-hand corner, we need to finish that one. And then, Lord willing, we need to get to number 5 today. And number 5 was the brand new one that you picked up when you came in. So we will start with the few, the chosen, the faithful, and trust that the Lord will bring in some more before our class is over. So let's open with a word of prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, once again, we just marvel at your exceeding abundant goodness to us on a daily basis. Thank you for the way you meet each need, whatever it might be, physical, emotional, spiritual, financial, social, the way you just take care of your children. We thank you. We thank you for the way you take care of your earth and for blessing us these last couple days with not just rain, but some lovely snow. We thank you not just for the snow, but even the beauty in the way that you give it to us. And pray for safety for those who are still traveling and for all of us as we travel today, that you'll watch over us and keep us safe. Most of all, right now, we're thankful for your word, however, and we're thankful that you have given us this specific chapter in Hebrews chapter 11 to focus our eyes on those who were faithful to you in the ups and downs of life, and we thank you that you reward such lives, that you know what the challenges are we face, and when we're simply willing to commit ourselves to you and to be confident in your promises and act accordingly, we thank you that you bless us. So bless this time now and make it profitable for Jesus' sake. Amen. Okay, in Hebrews chapter 11, we are in this section of verses 20 to 22, where we have 3 characters from the Old Testament that follow Abraham. They take up about half of the book of Genesis, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And we're down to 11:21, Hebrews 11:21, concerning Jacob. And as we said, it seems pretty amazing the way God, with so much material in the Old Testament, and then he only devotes one verse to each of these individuals here. And as we said last week concerning Isaac, we somewhat struggle, if you will, in trying to figure out, well, how was this an act of faith that he really did? And I think we're going to see that a little bit more as well with Jacob. And then when it comes to Joseph, I think it's going to be really evident what an act of faith he had. But the quote at the very top of your sheet there, sheet number 4, what impresses the author about these patriarchs was that they had a faith that looked beyond death. With all 3, the significant thing was their firm conviction that death cannot frustrate God's purposes. Their faith was such that they were sure God would work His will, so they could speak with confidence of what would happen after they died. And you can note in that quote those words that recurred there in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. So we get to 11:21 with Jacob. Everybody has the sheet from last week. Anybody need a sheet from last week? You're with us, so you have it. Okay. So 11:21, it tells us, by faith, Jacob, when he was a-dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. Now, when we come to Jacob, the story is found back in chapter 48, verses 1 to 22 of Genesis. And he was an old man when this story occurred. Back in Genesis 48, it says that he was sick. 48:2 says when his son entered the room that he sat up on his bed. 48:10 tells us his eyes were dim, etc. So probably this particular event that's being referred to is about 1859. So if you will look at your timeline on the top of your sheet, 1859 was when Jacob died at 147 years old. So probably this particular blessing came about or was spoken around 1859 or thereabouts. Now, when we think of Jacob in the Old Testament, probably words like deceive or deception, crafty, clever, something like that come to mind instead of a life of faith. We generally don't think of Jacob and say, oh, what a man who trusted God. But I'm going to give you a spoiler alert at the beginning here, so if you don't want to know, cover your ears so I won't spill the beans too early. But I think, again, we're going to see with Jacob, just like we saw with Abraham or with Isaac, it was a matter of God was constantly at work in their lives, just trying to teach them to trust Him a little bit more every day. And you remember from our previous handouts when we just tried to chart, if you will, Abraham's life. Abraham's life was just an up and down affair where he really trusted God, and you said, yes, the guy's got his act together. And a chapter later or so, it's like the bottom fell out, and it's, come on, man, what are you doing? You're acting just like the contemporary pagans who are around you. And then all of a sudden, a couple chapters later, we're back up here on the mountaintop, and his life is just constantly an up and down. And each time, as we said, hopefully each up is a little higher up, and each down is a little less down. But God worked through him. God was at work through him to try and teach him, and he was growing in his faith. And of course, with all of us, as we look in a mirror, we realize that, boy, that's the way our lives often are. They're up, and then they're down, and then they're up, and then all of a sudden some contemporary wind comes along, and we kiss up to that, and then we ask for forgiveness, and then we grow again. And I say all this because I think it ought to greatly encourage us as believers when we think of people that God recognizes as heroes. These are not people who walked forward at an invitation, got saved, and the rest of their life was just one straight line up. In other words, that they were just so sanctified that basically they just never sinned after that. No, they were real human beings living in a real environment with a lot of real contemporary winds that did very easily blow them around. So that's what we seem to see here with this man Jacob, how he is going to be growing in faith as the story progresses. So on your sheet, I put just about 4 quick things to remember about him. Those of you who just came in last week, how many of you need a sheet from last week? The sheet you got at the door coming in, we're going to get to in a minute, but you need one of these if you don't have these from last week. Anybody need one from last week? I think that's 2. If not, I can give you another one. There you go. Anybody else need the sheet from last week so you can follow along? You have yours, but okay. Good to have you back with us, this side of the mountain. Okay, everybody's with us. Okay, so notice some of those things that I did put on your sheet. Number 1, God had placed Jacob in the line of the Abrahamic covenant, and he was aware of his specialness. Okay, he knew that he was special, and you can go back to the Old Testament and read this. We're going to try and be a little hurried here. Esau sold his birthright. You remember that story in chapter 25. And of course, when we read that, we say, well, yeah, this guy was a fast-talking guy who knew how to talk his brother out of something. But have you ever noticed the Bible never condemns Jacob for what he did? The blame is always on Esau. And I mean, if his brother comes in and says, I'm going to die unless you give me a snack, we don't eat supper till 6 and it's only 5:45, that kind of thing. And so he just said, well, of course I'll give you something now. But in the New Testament, book of Hebrews, it specifically calls Esau a profane man. And that is a word that simply means he was godless or irreligious. And so here was a guy that, again, the blame is really on Esau. When it came to Jacob stealing the blessing, remember it was his mother Rebekah's idea. Okay? And he tried to talk his mother out of it. And he said, but Mom, there are going to only be bad things that happen if I do this. And she said, son, if you look in the text twice, she says, son, obey me. Son, obey me. You do what I said. We've got this figured out. Now, granted, when he went to his dad, We find that he lied and he deceived his dad several times and so on. But remember, the prophecy before he was even born said, the elder shall serve the younger. And I sometimes wonder if maybe in the back of his mind he hadn't heard that growing up. And so he was just kind of thinking, well, maybe this is the way that it all comes about. Even though humanly speaking, it was deceptive. And number 4, when he went to Laban's house to get a wife, now by this time in the story, maybe you're laughing and you're applauding because you're saying, aha, Jacob finally meant somebody who's a little more shrewd than he is, somebody who's a little more clever than he is, okay? However, God was overseeing all of that to the fulfillment of what God had already promised. So as I put on your sheet, perhaps we can say through all these things, his faith was a growing faith, although yet he was ever attempting to help God by making his own clever arrangements. In other words, it was a matter of he's trying to trust God, if you will, and yet at the same time, and again, how many times do we do this? It's kind of like, but you know what? I think God painted himself in a corner, and I've got to do this to help God in this situation. And God is trying to pull the rug out from under him a little bit at a time throughout his life, saying, you don't need to help me with this. I've got it figured out. You just need to be faithful. You just need to be a man of God. And then on your sheet, I put what I think are three defining moments where we can say God broke him. Okay? In other words, as God keeps working with him to increase his faith, I think there are these 3 key times that are very significant. First of all, Jacob's ladder in chapter 28 of the book of Genesis. Remember, this is when he was heading out of the country to go up to Haran to get his wife. When God met him in this ladder, this dream, God confirmed the covenant promises. So in other words, God said, in effect, I've got this under control. God promised his presence with Jacob with him, and God says, I will do everything that I have promised. And so he should have known, okay, I really can trust God. There aren't any ifs, ands, or buts about it. God says this is the way it's going to be. I've just got to be faithful. And at that moment, he vowed his allegiance, and he named the place Bethel, which is the Hebrew word. Beth is the Hebrew word for house, and El is one of the words for God. So he says, this is God's house. I have met with God right here. And that's a pretty significant thing. And then Jacob wrestled with a man in chapter 32. Okay, years have passed. He's now coming back home, returning to Canaan with his wives, with his children, with all of his stuff. And he was scared because he figured he was probably going to be meeting Esau. And of course, it was right for him to be scared, if you will, because when he left, Esau said, Dad's going to die pretty soon, and as soon as Dad dies, I'm going to kill my brother. And now years have passed, and so it's no wonder as he's coming home, he's scared like, whoa, with that kind of an attitude that just percolated, if you will, through the years, when I get home, this is not going to be a pleasant situation. So he's trying to, shall we say, work out details. And yet, in chapter 32, Jacob prayed God's promises. I wish we had time to spend about the whole class period just looking at this, because this is a really neat thing in the Old Testament when you study these prayers and how many times they simply pray back to God what God had already told them he was going to do. In other words, that in itself is an act of faithfulness, because they're saying, I believe that what God told me is true and he will pull it off, and therefore I can trust him. So I'm going to just remind him. And remember, it's not that God has a poor memory and needs to be reminded, but I'm going to just bring this up again and say, okay, God, I am living by faith on your promises. And in 32:9-12, he says, remember, God, you are my God. Number 2, remember, you told me to return home. I didn't just say, well, I'm sick of living up here in Haran and I want to go back home. You told me now's the time for you to go because that's where I'm supposed to live. Number 3, you are the one who ultimately blesses. I love that because think of how many times up to this point in his life, when he sought a blessing, it was through his trickery. And now I think we see a real step of faith here when he says, you know what, God, I don't have what I have because I'm such a slick talker or I know how to maneuver and manipulate people. I have what I have because you are the blesser. And number 4, he said, you promised me numerous progeny. Now, he already had a lot of children, so you kind of wonder if, he's a little scared and he's thinking, my brother could just literally wipe out our whole family here when he meets us. But God, you promised I was going to have numerous ancestors, and so I'm banking on it, the fact you're going to somehow keep us safe. In other words, to put it in my words, I would say he's simply telling God, okay, God, I'm done with tricks. I'm done with deception. I'm done with my smooth talking. I realize I can't get myself out of another pickle jar like I've always tried to in the past by taking it upon myself and thinking I'm good enough to do what I need to do. He simply says, okay, God, I'm trusting you to help me because you're the only one who can really help me. And God changed his name, remember, from being Jacob, which has to do with like grabbing somebody's heel, supplanting them. And he said, your name is now going to be Israel, which means basically you strove with God. You wrestled with God. And remember, as he wrestled with God, he said, I'm not going to let you go, God, until you give me a blessing. And of course, he would have a perpetual indication for the rest of his life that he had wrestled with God because God threw his hip out of place. And that should have been a sufficient reminder the rest of his life that if you can't wrestle with God and win, shall we say, you've got to simply submit to God and give in to him. And he called the name of the place Peniel, which is the Hebrew words for face and God. He says, I have seen God face to face. Wow, there aren't too many people in the Old Testament that could have that kind of a testimony. So again, I think we're seeing God breaking him little by little. And so I put on your sheet, this wrestling with the angel, or wrestling with God, is meant to epitomize the whole of the Jacob narratives. Jacob had struggled with his brother, his father-in-law, and finally God. And now God had broken him. God had given him this reminder that he would always have with him, with his dislocated hip, that you can't fight against God. You simply trust God. God can be counted on. And finally then, I think the last way that I see God breaking him was when Joseph, his favorite son, was presumed dead. You go back, of course, to Genesis 37, and it tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than any other son. He had this special coat for him. As the story unfolds, we're not told that Jacob's self-dependency had decreased, but it does seem that he was now at a place where he realized there was absolutely nothing he could do to solve this problem. I mean, literally, there was no swift talking, whatever. His sons came back, they presented the garment, etc., and it's like, he's dead. Joseph has died, and therefore, I'm not going to see him again. And the text tells us how grieving he was, and he just figured from then until the day of his death, he was going to be grieving. But finally, in Genesis 48:11, when he did bless Joseph's sons, he admitted that he had never planned to see Joseph again, and now he saw his sons. And I think, shall we say, this was perhaps when he blessed Joseph's sons. This was indeed this final act of faith, if you will, because he says God can be trusted. Wow. Look at the way God worked out all these things. God didn't need me to try and work them out or anything of the case. And so, as I think I put there on your sheet, although the Messianic line would not go through Joseph, yet Jacob favored Joseph by elevating his two sons on the same level with Joseph's brothers, and thus when we speak of the 12 tribes of Israel, 2 of them are actually Jacob's grandsons, so he gave Joseph a double portion. And as I put, perhaps part of the significance of this act of faith is that Manasseh and Ephraim were actually born in Egypt and had never seen Canaan. And so the logical thought is, well, why would they ever want to go to Canaan and live there when life in Egypt is good? They have Egyptian citizenship. They were born here. They've never known what Canaan is like or anything of the sort. But perhaps part of his act of faith was that he simply was acknowledging that they would not remain in Egypt as Egyptians, shall we say, but they would indeed inherit the promises just like the other sons of Jacob. So, as I said at the beginning, his life is kind of a strange one when you try and interpret some of these and wrestle with how was this an act of faith, but I think ultimately this was a pretty big jump for him when he was acknowledging these things as he came to the end of his life. So, that is Jacob. Questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions, better interpretations? Okay, and then finally in Hebrews 11:22 with Joseph, by faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel, and he gave commandment concerning his bones. The story here, you'll find this story back in Genesis chapter 50, verses 22 to 26. And maybe we ought to quickly read those verses. Genesis 50, 22 to 26. Now, Joseph died in 1805 BC. You can see that on your timeline at the top of the handout. 1805 BC is when he died at 110 years old. So it's very possible that this command to his brothers was that very year. Okay? And even though, of course, he didn't know how long it would be until the Exodus event that he talks about here, we do know it would be about 359 years. Because you can see on your timeline, the Exodus was in 1446. So he was actually talking about an event that would not come for about another 3.5 centuries, but he believed God's promise and he was banking on it. So in Genesis chapter 50, verses 22 following, Joseph dwelled in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. He saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were brought up upon Joseph's knees. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and now catch this, God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land he sware to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, notice he repeats it, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from hence. And he died 110 years old, and they embalmed him and put him in a coffin in Egypt. So, I emphasize those two expressions because notice what the content of his believing was. The first thing to notice is he believed in the Exodus. In other words, as it said there in verses 24 and 25, God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land. The English word surely there is simply a way of emphasizing what the Hebrew emphasizes. The Hebrew has a way of repeating the same Hebrew word back to back, and it's not because the writer was stuttering or it was redundant. He simply is saying, visiting you, God will visit you. And so in English, people would say, well, that's not a very good English way to say it. So usually in English, when there is that Hebrew construction, we use the word surely, which is just like underlining it. God's not going to merely visit you or meet your need. God is going to surely, for sure, Take it to the bank, count on it, underline it, put it in asterisk. And that's what he said 2 times here as he's dying. I am sure, I am so sure, I'm very sure, I'm convinced of this, that God is going to bring us up out of Egypt. Now that is a real act of faith. And like I say, he didn't know that it was going to be 359 years down the road until it would happen. But he believed in the promises of God in God's own timing. And of course, you say, well, what convinced him so much of this? I mean, what really drove this into his soul? And it easily could be that he had just been reminded as he was growing up of those great promises, or that great promise God made back in Genesis 15 to Abraham. Remember what God told Abraham? Your descendants are going to go to a foreign land. They're going to basically be a stranger there for 400 years. Then I will judge you and I will bring you out. And maybe on his calendar at home he was tracking some stuff there. Who knows? But I can't help but believe that might have been part of his firm conviction, that he had heard those promises of God repeated so many times that he simply said, this isn't just what Grandma likes to say every Sunday afternoon when we go over after lunch and she just keeps repeating herself because she's getting old and senile. This is a promise of God that I can take to the bank. Secondly, in Genesis there, he says, God has covenanted to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob the land. So in other words, he was saying, I believe God's original promise to Abraham. So he simply is believing what God says. Alonzo?
Was Egypt part of the promise for them not going to the land where God had told them to?
Question is, was it like a judgment by sending them down there? And basically, no, it was not, because in the account in Genesis, God says that one of the reasons I'm driving you out, or the major reason, is because it's not time yet to give you the land, because the iniquity of the local inhabitants has not reached its boiling point, if you will. And so in other words, it's like God is saying, those Canaanites are evil, but they haven't gone over the top on the thermometer, as I would simply state it. And so God was saying, I'm going to give them some more time, and in the meantime, there are lessons to teach you down in Egypt. Yeah, very, very fascinating indeed. Okay, so, as I put on your sheet, in one sense, it almost seems strange that Joseph wanted to be buried in Canaan. Because remember, he had only spent 17 years of his life in Canaan. When he was a 17-year-old boy, he'd been shipped out of the land. The rest of his life, the entirety of his life, I mean, he was an Egyptian. He had lived in a foreign country. His wife was an Egyptian. Wonder if his in-laws were complaining, saying, you can't take our daughter that far away. And humanly speaking, life was good in Egypt. They were in a good portion of the land. They were prospering at that time. He was influential. Remember how influential Joseph was? And his family was all present. Why in the world would you want to pull up roots and move hundreds and hundreds of miles away, or even think that would be a good thing to do? It was because he knew he was only a stranger in Egypt. God was sending him back to the promised land. Now, when I ask the question, why would he want to be buried in Canaan? Well, perhaps it was because 54 years earlier, and you can see on your sheet there, in 1859, when his dad Jacob died, remember they had carried Jacob back to Canaan. And so maybe there was a strong impetus. Maybe when he got back, he saw, the burial tomb of his ancestors, etc. And so he said, hey, that's where I want to be buried. But I think probably the real reason he wanted to was simply what we would call the obedience of faith, where it's very evident Joseph engaged in what I would simply call otherworld thinking. In other words, he didn't just look at its circumstances the way people do. He looked at them the way God does. It's the vertical way of looking at things instead of the horizontal way. And because of everything he had experienced in his lifetime, as I put a quote on your sheet, in the soul of Joseph burned the confidence that one day God's purpose must be fulfilled, however unreasonable it appeared at that present moment. And when you go back and you look at his life, it's interesting how much he saw the hand of God at every stage of his life. The good, the bad stages, and if you will, the good stages. And so quickly, as I listed on your sheet, in chapter 39 of Genesis, what I would call the sexual test. He had an opportunity to be involved in immorality, and what did he say? He didn't say, well, whoa, if I would get caught, the king, Pharaoh would have my head. He said, how can I sin against God? He says, this is a God thing. This isn't just as the world looks at it. Chapter 40 and verse 8, he's in prison, and they come to him to try and interpret the dream, and he says, well, interpretations belong to God. It's not just that I'm so smart. Chapter 41, multiple times he's still in prison. He says, the answer's not in me, it's God who's going to tell you what the future holds. Chapter 41, he has 2 sons born. He named both of them, or he named one Manasseh, which means forgetting, and he said, I'm calling him Manasseh because God has caused me to forget all my hardship. He named the other son Ephraim, meaning fruitful, because he says, God has made me fruitful. So see, this is a God thing again. He sees that physical blessing in that way. Chapter 45, to his brothers, when he made himself known to them, and they were like, oh no, our brother's really going to be mad at us because look at what we did in shipping him off here. And he said, hey, don't worry about it. God sent me ahead of you. This was part of God's purpose. In chapter 45, he said to his brothers again, God is the one who put me in this exalted position. And in chapter 50, this is 17 years after his brothers had moved to Egypt. And this ought to remind us how sin, how our conscience can bother us for, shall we say, unconfessed sin, or can cause us to think about things from the past. 17 years after they found out that their brother was still alive in Egypt, they now said, you know what, our dad is dead, and I'll bet you he's going to come after us and get even with us, but he just didn't want to do it while Dad was alive. And when they told him, I think the text says he wept. It's like, what kind of person do you think I am? He says, no. God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. This is a God thing. Don't look at it the way humans look at it. Look at it the way God looks at it. And again, I see all these steps of faith in his life where God is at work in his life. And thus, as I put the quote, what a triumph. A man who could see through the immediate to the ultimate. A man who could see beyond all the machinations of men the purpose and the power of Almighty God. And that's why when he was dying, he says, okay, here are the promises of God to our people. And I'm claiming those. I'm trusting God. So when I die, I want you to take my bones back with you. And of course, in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 19, it tells us at the time of the Exodus, they actually did transport it. And then at the end of the book of Joshua, after they've basically phase 1, if you will, of conquering the land, it says they buried his bones in Shechem just like he had wanted. Hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. But the promise was now fulfilled. So, 3 very, very interesting characters, but God was at work in each of their lives, trying to take them step by step to a higher level of faith and encouraging them in the process. And of course, you can go back to Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 11 and see exactly how their lives fulfilled what Hebrews 11:1 tells us concerning faith. Okay, very quickly, any closing comments on that? You still with us? Okay, let's quickly move to your sheet for today. This is the one that's week number 5. If you didn't get one, there still should be some available there when you come in. So get up and get one of those sheets if you don't have one so you can follow along. And we now come to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23. Hebrews 11 and verse 23, where it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. So actually, we're not introduced, shall we say, to Moses so much right now as to his unnamed parents who exhibited such an incredible amount of faith. And this is about 279 years from our last hero, Joseph, we just mentioned, because you can look on your timeline there. Joseph's death was 1805, and now the birth of Moses is going to be in 1526. So again, as you study, I think it's very important to have a timeline or to be thinking like this, because as we read this, it's really easy to say, oh, okay, somebody died, now here's the very next event, without realizing how much history. I mean, and I like to think of it then in light of maybe American history and say, whoa, 280 years? What happened 280 years ago and all that history's been skipped and now we're all of a sudden in 2021? Okay? So we come to Moses' parents, and thankfully, if you will, the Old Testament does give us the names of his parents. Their names are Amram and Jochebed. And so you see that on the timeline just to the right of 1805. And you see the Old Testament texts that tell us that. And it was their faith that caused them to act as this verse talks about. And of course, their faith had great ramifications. So, the story that is being referred to here by the writer of Hebrews is back in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 15 to chapter 2 and verse 10. And you know the historical context, so we'll be real quick in our summary here. But this was a very treacherous time if you were an Israelite couple to bring a child into the world. Okay? The Israelites were multiplying. Pharaoh feared that if a war would break out, the Israelites would side with the enemy. So he said, we can't allow that to happen. Pharaoh upped the ante of their workload, if you will, thinking that would somehow keep the population down. But through it all, God was causing them to multiply more and more and more. So now, as we come to the text, or as we're at the text there in the book of Exodus, Pharaoh has a major dilemma. As I put it on your sheet, Pharaoh's first solution to the Jewish problem. Kind of sounds like modern terminology that we've seen through history, huh? So what is going to be his solution to try and do away with the Israelites? He said, okay, he told the midwives, you kill any male when they're born, but you spare the girls. Very, very interesting, and we won't take the time to go into the account about all the logistics of it or how it could have happened, the morality, whatever. But it says they feared God and they refused to obey. And because they trusted God instead of Pharaoh's command, God did greatly bless them, etc. Another really interesting thing in the text there. But the Israelites, of course, kept multiplying then, simply because they didn't obey, and so the Israelite males were born, Israelite females were born, etc. Now, here is something to think about, and I can't prove this either way, and you can't disprove about what I'm going to say either, I don't believe. But this is interesting to think about. Perhaps this means that when Aaron was born, he should have been one of those who was killed by Pharaoh's decree. Okay? Because think of this on a timeline. Here we are, and we know that Moses was born in 1526, and the text tells us that Aaron is 3 years older. So Aaron was born in 1529. Now, exactly when Pharaoh's decree came to drown the babies, we know that's here. But his previous decree over here that said, kill them at birth, was that the decree that was in place just 3 years earlier? And if it was, it's really interesting to think that he was a boy who was providentially spared because because the midwives simply didn't do what they were supposed to do. They disobeyed God.
When the midwives, they were pretty much Hebrews, right?
No, they were I think they were Egyptian. It said, yeah. By the, pardon? Let's see, does it tell us? I think their names, however, give it away. Shiphrah. Okay, they were Hebrew midwives. Yeah. But it's amazing that these it's amazing that they would obey God when, I mean, their life could have been on the line themselves. It's like, whoa, how do you tell the Pharaoh, I'm not going to listen to your Supreme Court decision on this? Well, I guess there are people who say Supreme Court said, but I don't need to follow it, but that's a whole other story, okay? But
and was it only those two boys that were spared by the midwives? I mean, or did they just disobey and not kill any man?
Exactly, and of course, critics come to this and they say, well, there is no way that two midwives could have been serving the entire Israelite community. Basically, this is, I think, the best interpretation or the best way to look at it is they were kind of, shall we say, over the guild of midwives. In other words, they were the ones who had women working under them, and so they would have simply told these others, hey, don't you perform your duties, don't you do what you need to do. So this was not just, this was basically meant for all the Israelite children, right?
And the assumption is, because the Hebrew was growing so fast and so numerous, boys had to be born and not killed. You know what I'm saying? Because marriage and all of this stuff had to be happening.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, humanly speaking, it sounds like a pretty good plan, if you will. But again, that's this worldly thinking instead of obeying what God has said.
And the practicality of it, God had to be all over it because babies cry. And you had to imagine that the Egyptians were there supervising the Hebrews. So for them to never discover the infant children, male children, is a God thing right in itself.
Right. Oh, yeah. God is super involved, if you will, in every part of the story. Amazing the way the little pieces of the puzzle just come together. So what is Pharaoh's next solution, as I put on your sheet? His second solution to the Jewish problem: every boy that is born, you cast them into the river, but you save every girl alive. And this is when we come then to the Moses story in 1526. Amram and Jochebed were both in the tribe of Levi, which of course, shall we say, their genealogical tree produced the family of the high priests, because you have Levi, and then you have Kohath, and then one of Kohath's descendants is Amram. Amram and Jochebed's son is Aaron, the first high priest. When Aaron died, his son Eleazar, etc. So this is the genealogical tree of the priesthood. Now, Exodus 2 and verse 2 does not elaborate on why they spared Moses. In other words, it says, here's this couple. They get married. She gets pregnant, they have a child, and all it says is that when he was born, she saw he was goodly, and that's what made her hide him for 3 months instead of immediately following the king's decree. So what does it mean he was goodly? That's a really good expression. That's a really good question, because the word is used in the Old Testament to refer to people who look good, women who look good. It's used in Daniel of the boys who look good. It's used in Esther of people. It's used of cities in the book of Deuteronomy. It's used of houses in the book of Deuteronomy. So in other words, it just would appear that, basically he was just a cute little boy, if we would say. But I think, as we're going to see here, it was more than they said, he's cuter than any other child in the nursery, so I don't think we should kill him. No, there's a lot more to it than that. But I think they saw something in him that they realized God has a plan for this boy. Now, when we come to Hebrews 11:23, we don't have much help. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months by his parents because they knew it was illegal or it was immoral to kill a child. It's not what it says. It simply says they saw he was a proper child. Oh, wow, so here's where you get all the help. The Greek word proper simply means good looking, beautiful, fair. It doesn't really change anything from what the Old Testament says, okay? Simply says they saw he was a good looking child. Now, the only other time that Greek word is used in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 7 and verse 20, when Stephen is preaching, and he's preaching Israelite history, and when he gets to this account, he says, "And Moses was born, who was beautiful," or good. But he does add two more words. He was beautiful to God. And so through the years, the English translators have really struggled with that, saying, what does it mean that this boy, Moses, was beautiful to God? In other words, Wycliffe, the original translation into English, he said he was loved of God. Tyndale, who came along later, said he was a proper child in the sight of God. King James Version says he was exceedingly fair. So what in the world is going on here? Well, as I put on your sheet, the meaning appears to be the child was just so exceptionally beautiful, his parents believed God had some special plan for him. In other words, somehow the parents saw in him something that made them believe this child really is special. And it doesn't mean that they believed it would have been okay to kill him anyhow, but it was like, whoa, there's something, somehow God is going to use this child. And I mean, their thought process, and again, I can't prove this, but I just kind of think of the way we look at things when we have options in front of us. Their thought process could have been maybe something like, okay, the king's edict is kill the baby boys. So do we want this worldly thinking? Do we really believe that would be the way to go? And they're saying, no, that's not what God commands, murder. Then they might have said, you know what, we can see what the king is saying, the edict, with our eyes. But remember, what does Hebrews 11 constantly remind us faith is all about? Pardon? It's what you don't see. In other words, you are able to see what you cannot see with your eyes because you trust God and you say there is a God involved in this. And so it's not a matter of making a decision on what I can see. It's making a decision on faith in the God that I cannot see. And then perhaps they even looked back on their history and said, you know what? Look at our Israelite history. And they had plenty of history even by that time to look back at how God had so marvelously worked in the history of His people. And their thought could have been, you know what? God is going to somehow get us through this. We need to trust God. We need to do what we can do, but then we need to trust God that He's going to get us out of this pickle jar and solve the problem for us. And so as I put on your sheet, I believe this is a good example where we see that faith is not blind. Because critics will always say, well, faith is just jump off a cliff and hope that God does something incredible. No, that's stupidity. That's dumbness. That's not faith. Faith means you look at the object and you say, is the object someone I can assuredly trust in because of what he has said? And so they simply banked on God's promises, and then they said, okay, now what can we do, however, humanly speaking, to try and save our child? But we're going to have to trust God, who's going to have to work in all these circumstances. So his mother, of course, planned the river scene, but God was going to be the one who would have to intervene and make it happen. So on your sheet I put, faith does not lead to a disregard of the means. Everything had to be arranged down to the details. God uses means, but He's not bound by them. The birth, rescue, and youth of Moses must be considered a work of God's providence to keep His people alive. God's providence, and I love this, God's providence used natural factors. There was a mother who loved him, and that's what kicked this into action. A mother who said, I'm not about to kill my child. There was a sister who loved him. There was a mother's pity, Pharaoh's daughter. A woman's pity, Pharaoh's daughter. There was Israelite acumen, and there was the Egyptian culture. But it also took faith. It was precisely the commandment to throw the boys into the Nile that brought Moses to the Egyptian court. And what an irony. How was he supposed to be destroyed? by being thrown in the water. So his parents did throw him in the water in a different sense than what Pharaoh meant. And it was because he was there in the water that Pharaoh's daughter, who possibly was there actually as part of a religious washing, she could have been bathing, but it might have been some kind of religious ritual. And it was because she was there that God brought her at the very moment when this little boy was put in that ark, in that basket. All the motherly preparation is a beautiful illustration of the connection which should always exist between the diligent use of means and the pious trust in providence. Instead of sitting down in sullen despair or passive reliance on divine interposition, everything is done which can be done by human agency to secure the wished-for result. The woman has done her part, and the great God has been at the same time preparing His materials, arranging His instruments. He causes everything to concur, not by miraculous influence, because it's interesting, there wasn't any miracles in this that were done. It's not like the boy fell out of his ark and was on the bottom of the river for 20 minutes and somebody saw him and pulled him out, and miraculously for 20 minutes he hadn't breathed, but now he did. No. Nothing miraculous in the story. But everything is providential. By the simple and natural operation of second causes, God brought about the issue designed in His counsels from everlasting. So wow, what an incredible way that God is at work honoring the faith of the parents. Now quickly I say, okay, who was Pharaoh's daughter? Well, the Old Testament, and this is an interesting thing, the Old Testament never mentions these early Egyptian rulers. It's almost like, remember, they thought they were top dogs, they were number one, they knew everything. And in these early chapters of the Bible, God never mentions any of them by name. And you think of all the power they had, you think of how many tombs we have found and all the material wealth they had, but God doesn't even mention them. Like, don't worry about them. They're not significant in the overall scheme of things. Now, later on in history, God will mention a few by name to show that His prophecy proves true. But at this time in history, He doesn't, so He doesn't mention who the daughter is. But it is interesting, when you look at Egyptian chronology, if you follow basic Egyptian chronology, and there is a lot of debate with it, and there are a lot of, shall we say, hairy places in the Egyptian chronology, but following just basic standard Egyptian chronology that most, or the generally scholars would follow, the daughter here would be this individual named Hatshepsut, which indeed you hear about even today. She's a famous one. And when people look back at Egyptian history, they say, you know what, she is a woman who could have pulled off exactly what's talked about here. Because again, critics like to say, well, this is just a myth. There is no way in the world Pharaoh had a daughter who could snub her dad and say, I'm going to raise this Hebrew right here under your nose. But Hatshepsut could, because we know what kind of a woman she was. The power she had, if you will, her sassiness, the strength that she had. If there was ever a woman in Egyptian history who could pull this off under her dad's nose, it was Hatshepsut. So again, it's just a very interesting, very, very interesting thing chronologically when you try and check this out. So, as the writer of Hebrews reminds us, they were not afraid, his parents were not afraid of the king's commandment, or they were not afraid of what the king commanded. And that's why they said, we're trusting God. We're going to believe God's promises, and we are going to bank on that. And God honored their faith. And of course, when you look down history, you can see how God was sparing Moses because of the specific role He had for him in the history of the children of Israel. Well, you're not going to believe this, but maybe you will believe it. We are almost out of time, so we're going to need to stop at our worksheet there and jump forward to our more modern-day church hero. Lord willing, next Sunday I will not be here. I'm I'm going to be out of town speaking, but there's going to be a special speaker here. I don't know if this can, I say I don't know if it should be said publicly, and then I'm going to say it publicly, but I'm sure Tommy will be talking more about this. But next Sunday, Chris Anderson, who has written a lot of, or some of the music that we sing, etc., he is going to be here for the Sunday morning service, and he will also be teaching Sunday school. So, Lord willing, 2 weeks from today, we will have to pick up here. And I know this is asking an awful lot of you to wear the same shirt 2 weeks from today that you wore today, so you have this in your pocket. But when you come back 2 weeks from today, if you think of it, bring this sheet with you. Now, we need to go to the very end of your handout, however, and ask ourselves the question, okay, who is going to be our church history hero of the day? And I have chosen, shall we say, some heroines, some lady heroes of the Reformation era. When we think of the Reformation, remember we're way back, and we generally think of famous men. You think of like Martin Luther, you think of John Calvin, you think of Ulrich Zwingli, you think of Bucer, you think of Bullinger, you think of some of those names, etc. But we oftentimes fail to remember just how important faithful women were during that time and the key role that they played in making, shall we say, the Reformation come to pass. And indeed, when you start reading the lives of them, it is incredible. And of course, maybe you've even read books on like Katie Luther, Katharina von Bora Luther, or Idelette Deborah Calvin, etc., because there's some of the more famous ones. But we're talking about women that you've probably never heard of. I could bring you books and give you the names of women that I'd never heard of until I studied this subject. And you'd probably say I never heard of them before because I would have mispronounced them, since some of them were French names and I don't know French, okay? But I mean, it's incredible the number of faithful women during that time and what they did in order that there might really be a Reformation. So I've tried on your handout here to simply summarize what this one lady, Rebecca Van Dudewerd, at the end of her book, Reformation Women, 16th Century Figures Who Shaped Christianity's Rebirth, she in her book has about 10 different women. She devotes a chapter to 10 different women who played key roles, and none of them were these famous women I just mentioned. They were all, shall we say, other people you've probably never heard of. But when she comes to the end, she says, now when we look at all these Reformation women, what can we learn from them for lessons for our own lives today if we want to be a hero today in the sight of God? And so this is not just for ladies, this is also true for men. But wow, these are some powerful lessons. So notice what she says. The left-hand column, I give you some of the quotes, and then in the right-hand column is like the application. Number one, she says, there was a radical change in circumstances, but it did not stop their fruitfulness. In other words, as they went through life, they had to go through a lot of different things. Sometimes maybe they were married to a reformer, and then he was murdered, he was killed. And they didn't just say, well, my circumstances changed, I'm not going to serve God anymore. It was no. They remained fruitful and said, okay, I'm now a widow with 3 children. But God can still use me because life wasn't all about my husband, life was about God. And so even though my circumstances have changed, God has not changed. Number 2, they saw themselves first and foremost as Christians. Although their roles varied greatly at times, their true identity was they were in Christ. They didn't just say, well, my identity now is, and you can think of today where sometimes that's what the world plays on a lot. Well, this is your identity as a woman. You are a power broker, 40-hour-a-week, fast-running woman who does all these things, and all of a sudden they lose their job, and then, oh no, I'm falling apart emotionally. What do I do? Because that was my whole identity. And she reminds us, hey, for these ladies, their true identity was we're in Christ. So when all of these other things change, it didn't cause an emotional breakdown on their part. They simply said, my identity is I know Christ, and Christ hasn't changed, and I'm still His daughter, so I can still faithfully live for Him. Number 3, the Reformation women who were married to godly men knew that biblical headship and submission produced fruit. In other words, they were a perfect complement to their husbands. They said, what does my husband need right now as we serve the Lord together? And some of the times, they were incredible at hospitality. The way they would open their homes to refugees who were going through, because remember the upheaval and all the great population shifts. Like Katie Luther, she opened her almost every night around the dinner table. There would be students from the University of Wittenberg, theology students who loved to come and talk to her husband. And interestingly enough, we have a record of some of the things he said at the supper table. It's called Table Talk. And it came from later in his life, and some of the things that he said there are not very appropriate. Okay, he was kind of unguarded in some of the things he said, and then his students wrote it down, and it's come down to us. But the point I'm trying to make is, almost every night she was cooking for a whole kitchen full of people. It's also said that when he was translating the New Testament or the Bible, he would come home at night and he would like have her proofread it or read it to see how it sounded. And she didn't say, "No way, that's your job, that's not mine." And there were some of these other reformers' wives as well, who they would come home at night and they would give a Bible translation they'd been working on to their spouse, and she would read it and say, "Don't like this wording here. Oh, I think we ought to do that." Number 4, good leadership is servanthood. People saw how much they sacrificed to be a help and blessing to other people. In other words, life was not about them, it was about others. 5, everybody has gifts and everyone needs to use them. Unique gifts for unique times, unique places, and unique circumstances. And boy, you see that time in history, and you say it really was a unique time to simply say, how has God gifted me to meet the specific need of the hour in a world that is changing so quickly? Number 6, God uses individuals' faithfulness to bring about His kingdom. Every one of these women had faults. None of them were perfect. But it was their faithfulness, not their fame or power or public displays of piety, that the Lord values, rewards, and uses. And finally, death comes when our work is done, not before or after. Because of perspective, they lived consistently over a lifetime. They were aiming for things beyond their lifespans. It gave perspective and purpose to everyday actions. In other words, they simply said, in the light of eternity, what should I be doing today to be faithful? And they simply did it, and now we look back at them and say, that is incredible. That is incredible what they did to further the Reformation and to help their husbands to be able to further it as well. So, lots of heroes. There have been lots of heroes, and by the grace of God, hopefully there are lots of heroes sitting right here before me today. Okay, Lord bless you. Have a great week, shoveling snow, putting another log on the fire, drinking another cup of coffee, whatever.